Iran's most powerful weapon was never a missile. It was a 21-mile gap in the water. I know that sounds reductive. I know you're thinking about the nuclear program, the drone fleets, the proxy networks stretching from Tehran to Beirut to Sana'a. But strip all of that away. Strip away every headline from the last 2 decades, and you find the same card sitting underneath all of it. The Strait of Hormuz, a choke point so narrow, so indispensable, so geometrically irreplaceable, that Iran didn't need to fire a single shot to hold the global economy hostage. It just needed to exist next to it. That card is now being systematically destroyed, not by military force, not by sanctions, by concrete, steel pipe, and the quiet engineering ambition of countries that have spent 40 years deciding they are done being vulnerable. This is Iron Dispatch. I'm glad you're here. And if this kind of deep geopolitical infrastructure analysis is what you came for, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Because what's happening right now in the Arabian Peninsula is one of the most consequential infrastructure stories of the century, and almost nobody is covering it at the level it deserves. Let's establish exactly what is at stake. Every single day, approximately 20 million barrels of oil pass through the Strait of Hormuz. That is roughly 1/5 of all the oil traded on planet Earth, moving through a corridor that, at its narrowest point, is just 21 miles wide. Not 21 miles of open ocean, 21 miles of shallow, navigable lane, threading between the Iranian coastline on one side and the Omani peninsula of Musandam on the other. The shipping lanes themselves are only 2 miles wide in each direction, with a 2-mile buffer between them. You could drive across the entire passage in under 30 minutes. For decades, Iran understood exactly what that geography meant. It didn't need to close the strait permanently. The threat alone was enough. Every time tensions spiked, every time Washington tightened sanctions, every time Riyadh made a move Tehran didn't like, the Islamic Republic would gesture toward the strait and watch the oil markets shudder. It was elegant, really, an entire foreign policy built on the fact that the world had no alternative. Here's what changed. In early 2026, that theoretical threat became real in a way it never had before. The specifics of the crisis are still being analyzed, but the operational reality was stark. 3,200 vessels found themselves effectively trapped, caught between a closing maritime corridor and a 48-hour ultimatum issued by the U.S. president demanding the strait remain open. A 22-nation military coalition scrambled to execute mine-clearing operations, because Iran's capacity to deploy over 5,000 naval mines in those shallow waters had always been the silent trump card behind the bluster. Suddenly, the bluster had teeth. 3,200 ships. That is not a statistic. That is the global supply chain, frozen. The Gulf states watched. They had been watching and preparing for a long time. But 2026 was the moment the preparation became acceleration. So what are the actual alternatives to Hormuz? Because this is where most coverage stops at the map and starts waving at the empty desert. The reality is far more specific and far more complicated than the headlines suggest. Start with what already exists. Saudi Arabia built the Petroline, officially the east-west crude oil pipeline, decades ago. It runs 1,200 kilometers from the oil fields of the eastern province westward to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Capacity: 7 million barrels per day. That is a significant fraction of the daily Hormuz flow, redirected entirely around the strait, pouring into the Red Sea instead of the Persian Gulf. It exists. It functions. It was built precisely because the Saudis understood, even in the 1980s, that Hormuz was a structural liability. The UAE built its own version, the Habshan-Fujairah pipeline, running from the interior fields directly to the Omani Gulf Coast at Fujairah, bypassing Hormuz entirely by going around the tip of the peninsula rather than through the strait. The port at Fujairah has been quietly upgraded for years. Pair that pipeline with expanded berth capacity at Fujairah and the nearby port of Khor Fakkan, and you have a functioning bypass corridor. Not complete, not sufficient for full volume, but real. The cost of meaningfully expanding that infrastructure through new jetties and enhanced pipeline integration sits in the $200 to $500 million range. In infrastructure terms, that is a rounding error. It is the fastest, cheapest near-term option on the board, and the UAE knows it. But the Gulf states are not thinking in near-term options anymore. They are thinking in permanence. And that is where the engineering ambitions become genuinely extraordinary, and where the numbers start to demand serious attention. The Musandam Canal concept has circulated in strategic planning circles for years, but 2026 gave it political oxygen it had never previously received. The idea: cut a canal directly through the Musandam Peninsula, the narrow Omani finger of land that forms the southern jaw of the strait, connecting the Persian Gulf side directly to the Gulf of Oman. No Hormuz, no Iranian threat. A sovereign, controllable passage for tankers that effectively renders Iran's geographic leverage obsolete overnight. The problem is the geology. The Musandam Peninsula is not a sandbar. It is the Hajar Mountain range, jutting into the sea, peaks reaching 2,000 meters, composed of some of the hardest carbonate rock formations on the Arabian Peninsula. The proposed route, running from Ras Al-Khaimah on the UAE's Bazara coast through the mountains to Kasab or Dibba on the Omani Gulf side, would require excavating through terrain that makes the Panama Canal look like a garden project. Here is the number that stops every room cold. The rock excavation required for the Musandam Canal would demand 40 to 60 times the labor and material effort of the Panama Canal's expansion. The $5 billion expansion completed in 2016. Do the arithmetic. Even at optimistic projections, initial estimates came in at $100 billion. Realistic engineering analyses put the figure between $200 billion and $300 billion. And that assumes the geological surveys don't reveal worse conditions as you go deeper, which historically they always do. The canal would also need to accommodate VLCC supertankers, very large crude carriers, 300 meters in length, 300,000 tons fully loaded. That means a minimum channel depth of 25 meters and a width of 200 to 300 meters. You are not cutting a ditch through the Hajar Mountains. You are relocating them. Does that mean it won't happen? Not necessarily. It means it won't happen quickly, and it won't happen cheaply, and it absolutely requires the kind of sovereign wealth fund commitment that only a handful of entities on Earth can make without blinking. The UAE and Saudi Arabia between them have the capital. What they are calculating now is whether the strategic value justifies deploying it. The second major canal concept takes a completely different geographic approach. Instead of cutting through mountains, it proposes cutting through desert, the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter, the largest continuous sand desert in the world. A 950-kilometer canal running from the Saudi Arabian south coast, across the interior, down to the Gulf of Oman. This is the route that gets dismissed most quickly by people who have never looked at a topographic map of the Arabian Peninsula. Here is why that dismissal is wrong. The Rub al-Khali is not flat. That is the misconception that a name like empty quarter encourages. The terrain rises to elevations of up to 700 meters in places. The engineering challenges are different from Musandam. You are not blasting through granite mountains, but you are excavating across an active dune system over nearly 1,000 kilometers, managing the structural stability of a canal in shifting sand, building in a region with almost no existing infrastructure, extreme heat, and minimal water. A Saudi-backed feasibility study from 2008 estimated the cost at $200 billion. In 2026 dollars, with current material and labor costs, that number is substantially higher. The Rub al-Khali Canal is, honestly, the longer shot of the two. But the fact that it appeared in a formally commissioned feasibility study tells you something important about how seriously the Gulf states have been modeling their post-Hormuz future. Not as a contingency, but as an engineering problem to eventually be solved. Here is what most coverage completely misses about this entire infrastructure story. The goal is not necessarily to build any of these megaprojects to completion. The goal, the immediate politically actionable goal, is to make Iran believe they might. Because here is the strategic logic that transforms the entire equation. Every mile of new pipeline, every expanded berth at Fujairah, every published feasibility study, every signed engineering contract, all of it chips away at the one thing that gives the Hormuz threat its power, which is the perception of irreplaceability. Iran's leverage is not physical. Iran cannot permanently close the strait. The U.S. Fifth Fleet, the combined naval capacity of 22 allied nations, and the overwhelming financial motivation of every oil-importing economy on Earth would ensure that any physical closure would be temporary and catastrophically costly for Tehran. Iran's leverage is psychological. It is the market's belief, the trader's fear, the diplomat's calculation that there is no alternative. The moment an alternative exists, even a partial one, even one that handles only 30% of the daily flow, that psychological leverage evaporates proportionally. The Petroline already exists. The Fujairah route already moves significant volume. Every infrastructure dollar spent on bypass capacity is a direct devaluation of the Hormuz card, without firing a single shot, without a diplomatic confrontation, without a UN resolution. It is the most elegant form of strategic neutralization imaginable, and the Gulf states have been playing it, quietly and patiently, for decades. What 2026 did was collapse the timeline. The 3,200 trapped vessels, the presidential ultimatum, the mine-clearing operation. All of it created the political and economic justification to accelerate spending that might otherwise have taken another decade to greenlight. When the theoretical scenario becomes a real photograph of a paralyzed strait, the feasibility study cost-benefit analysis suddenly looks different. The $200 billion price tag for Musandam stops looking like an absurd number and starts looking like reasonable insurance on a $20 million barrel per day reality. There is also a dimension to this story that rarely appears in Western coverage. The Gulf states are not building these alternatives primarily to frustrate Iran, though that is a consequence they welcome. They are building them because the 21st century global energy architecture is undergoing a structural reorientation, and they intend to control their position in it rather than remain perpetually subject to a geographic accident. The transition toward renewable energy and consuming markets, slow and uneven as it is visible on a long enough timeline. The window during which oil infrastructure investment yields maximum return is not infinite. Moving now, building now, diversifying export pathways now, that is not a response to Iran. That is a response to time. Iran, for its part, is watching all of this and understanding the math. The mullahs did not build their foreign policy on Hormuz because they were naive about the long game. They understood that the card had a shelf life. What they perhaps miscalculated was how aggressively the 2026 crisis would accelerate the erosion of that shelf life. How the one real deployment of the threat would catalyze exactly the infrastructure response that makes the threat less credible for every year that follows. A weapon used is a weapon studied. A threat made real is a threat partially spent. The Arabian Peninsula is now engaged in one of the most expensive engineering mobilizations in modern history, measured not just in dollars but in strategic intent. Whether the Musandam Canal gets built in 10 years or 40, whether the al-Khali route stays a feasibility study or becomes a construction site, the direction of travel is unambiguous. The Gulf states are building their way out of Iran's chokehold, one pipeline, one port, $1 billion at a time. The strait is still open. It is still carrying 20 million barrels a day. Iran is still there, on the northern shore, with its mining capacity and its rhetoric and its calculation of leverage. But the calculation is changing, quietly, expensively, permanently. And the most important thing to understand about infrastructure is this: once it exists, it cannot be unbuilt. The bypass, once completed, changes the map forever. Not metaphorically, literally. The geography Iran has been renting as a weapon for 40 years is being re-engineered out from under it, and the invoice is already signed. Watch what happens next, because the pipeline isn't finished, and neither is this story.